Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. The thick leather-bound register preserved in the archives of the St. Jude Historical Society did not belong to any recognized parish. Bound in faded calfskin that had turned the color of dried bone, the volume bore no gold leaf lettering, no holy cross, and no administrative seal from the Diocese of Upper New York. Its pages were made of heavy vellum paper that retained a faint acrid smell of burnt cedar and sulfur, even after sitting untouched inside a climate-controlled vault for nearly a century. In the winter of 1889, Father Thomas Mercer, a quiet cleric assigned to the remote settlement of Blackwood Hollow, began documenting a sequence of spiritual anomalies that the local authorities refused to record. The town sat isolated in a narrow valley shadowed by towering hemlock trees, a community built over ancient limestone caverns where the natural light faded long before dusk. Before he ever unpacked his personal belongings, Mercer walked through the snow to inspect the parish registry in the church cellar, only to find the previous priest's log abruptly ended mid-sentence 6 months prior. The final ink entry was smeared with what appeared to be damp cellar mold, accompanied by a frantic marginal note ordering any successor to burn the parish keys if the ground froze before December. When Father Mercer arrived, he noted that the villagers observed a silent, unspoken ritual every evening as the sun dipped behind the western ridge. They did not ring the chapel bell, nor did they gather for evening prayers. Instead, every household lined their windowsills with crushed charcoal mixed with dried river salt. The locals called this barrier the solitary ash, claiming it prevented the weight of the valley's past from settling inside their homes while they slept. Thomas, trained in canonical theology and skeptical of rural superstition, dismissed the practice as a remnant of pagan folk magic. He recorded his observations in a small leather notebook, determined to replace their fear with traditional liturgy. He spent his first afternoon prying open the frozen iron gates of the cemetery, attempting to index the burial dates, but discovered that nearly half of the limestone markers bore no names, only carefully carved numbers matching entries in no known civil record. Yet, on his third night in the rectory, the silence of the valley was broken not by the howling mountain wind, but by the soft rhythmic sound of barefoot steps pacing across the dry leaves outside his window. The steps moved with deliberate slowness, pausing at every corner of the wooden structure before coming to a halt directly outside the rectory door. When Thomas lifted his oil lantern and looked through the glass, he saw no physical presence standing on the porch. The fresh layer of snow that had fallen earlier that evening was completely undisturbed, smooth as white linen under the pale moonlight. Yet, as he watched, the heavy iron latch of the front door slowly lifted from its cradle without a sound, as though pushed by a firm, practiced hand. A sudden sharp drop in temperature swept through the entryway, freezing the moisture on the glass panes into intricate, jagged crystals. Thomas stepped back, knocking his elbow against the wooden coat rack, sending his heavy woolen cloak clattering to the floorboards. The flame inside his lantern flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the hallway floor before dying out entirely, plunging the room into total blackness. In the dark, Thomas heard a sound that chilled him far more than the freezing air. From the empty hallway came the distinct, raspy sound of a voice whispering his own full name, a name he had disclosed to no one in the village since his arrival. The voice did not sound hostile or aggressive. It carried the tired, flat cadence of someone reading from an old ledger. It recited the exact dates of his ordination, the names of his deceased parents, and the secret, unconfessed doubts he had written in his private diary years ago during his seminary days in Boston. Panicked, Thomas reached into his coat pocket for a match, his hands trembling violently as he struck the sulfur tip against the dry brick hearth. The first two matches snapped in his fingers, scattering unlit phosphorus across the floorboards before the third match caught fire. When the tiny flame sputtered to life, he saw that the blank pages of his open notebook on the desk were no longer empty. They were covered in dense dark script written in a damp ink-like substance that smelled of stagnant well water, detailing events from his own childhood that he himself had long forgotten. The script that appeared across Father Mercer's notebook was not written in traditional Latin or English, but in an archaic form of liturgical shorthand used by 17th-century monastic scribes to document cases of spiritual possession. The letters were dark, thick, and slightly damp to the touch, as if the ink had been applied moments before the flame lit the room. As Thomas leaned closer to examine the text, he realized that the handwriting matched his own script precisely, replicating every stroke, curve, and flourish of his penmanship. The entry detailed a series of events that had not yet occurred, describing a storm that would sever the valley's access roads and the arrival of a young woman named Clara, who had been found wandering near the abandoned limestone quarry at the edge of town. Before he closed the ledger, Mercer noticed a faint bloodstain on the margin of the second page, accompanied by a precise timestamp marking the exact hour he would open the rectory doors the following evening. The following afternoon, the forecast written in the mysterious ink manifested with terrifying accuracy. A sudden violent blizzard swept down from the northern peaks, burying the roads under 5 feet of ice and heavy snow, cutting off Blackwood Hollow from the surrounding townships. Before Thomas could secure the chapel windows against the rising gale, a heavy pounding rattled the oak doors of the sanctuary. He ran down the center aisle, unbolting the freezing iron latches while the wind howled against the wooden frame. Standing on the stone steps, half frozen and wrapped in a soaked wool shawl, was Clara. She was a quiet, pale woman whose family had lived in the valley for generations, though she had spent the previous 5 years living in a convent 3 towns over. She spoke in low, broken sentences, explaining that she had felt an overwhelming involuntary impulse to walk back to the valley, guided by a voice that had called to her from the bottom of the dry stone well behind her family's homestead. Thomas brought the shivering woman into the rectory, placing her near the iron stove while he prepared tea. He fetched a thick woolen blanket from his bedchamber, wrapping it tightly around her trembling shoulders as she stared unblinking at the floorboards. However, as he reached for the kettle, he noticed that Clara's shadow cast against the whitewashed wall did not move in synchronization with her physical body. While she sat completely still, her hands clasped tightly around a wooden cup, her shadow slowly raised its arms, stretching its fingers upward toward the low wooden beams of the ceiling. The silhouette moved with fluid, unnatural grace, its head tilting at a sharp, unnatural angle, as if listening to something buried deep beneath the floorboards. When Thomas turned around to face her, Clara's eyes were fixed on his leather register, her irises so dark that the boundary between the pupil and the iris had dissolved completely into pitch blackness. She spoke without moving her lips, her voice echoing from the corners of the room rather than from her mouth. "The book requires a scribe, Thomas," the voice echoed, carrying a deep resonant vibration that made the glass lantern chimneys rattle against their brass stands. "The valley does not forget the names spoken in the dark. You were brought here not to shepherd the living, but to complete the record." Clara then reached out and placed her palm flat onto the cover of the register. Where her skin touched the dried leather, a faint wispy cloud of white smoke rose into the air, carrying the sharp scent of burning bone. Outside, the church bell began to toll on its own, striking 12 heavy hollow notes that vibrated through the frozen ground beneath the sanctuary floorboards. The vibration rattled the iron hinges of the rectory door, causing the heavy latch to slip once more into place, locking both of them inside the freezing hall as the oil lamp went dark. The heavy falling snow outside the dark sanctuary grew so intense that the tall stained glass windows lining the long nave vibrated constantly within their brittle lead frames. Father Mercer stood frozen near the cold altar rail, watching silently as Clara remained motionless near the iron stove, her pale face softly bathed in the dim amber light cast by the dying hearth embers. She had not moved her pale hands from her lap since the ancient church bell finished its 12 hollow strikes. Yet the freezing air inside the room continued to grow progressively colder with every passing second. Every breath Thomas exhaled materialized instantly as a dense, swirling plume of white vapor that hung suspended in the absolute still air before dissolving into total nothingness. He looked down nervously at his worn leather register, resting completely open on the heavy oak lectern, its thick vellum pages now entirely covered in dark, glistening script that seemed to shift and pulse rhythmically whenever he turned his tired eyes away from the surface. Mercer reached out a trembling hand to touch the parchment margin, but his icy fingertips recoiled as a sharp burning sensation shot up his forearm, leaving a dark reddish mark across his skin. He observed with growing dread that the damp black ink was slowly spreading outward across the heavy vellum, filling every remaining blank margin with intricate geometric diagrams of the cavern floor plan beneath the church. Across the freezing sanctuary, Clara finally lifted her bowed head, her large dark eyes reflecting the fading embers of the wood fire. The thick shadow stretching across the lime-washed wall directly behind her did not mirror her physical movement. Instead, it remained slouched low against the dark wooden wainscoting, its outline dense, heavy, and ill-defined around the edges. When she finally opened her pale lips to speak, her low voice was barely more than a soft rustle of dry autumn leaves dragging across parchment. Yet it resonated with absolute clarity throughout the vast vaulted ceiling of the sacred chapel. She began telling him of the old abandoned stone quarry situated at the absolute edge of Blackwood Hollow, where the earliest settlers had painstakingly carved heavy foundation stones for the original settlement in the late 17th century. Beneath those deep subterranean limestone strata lay a vast network of flooded natural caverns, massive underground vaults that had remained tightly sealed behind iron-reinforced oak doors ever since the terrible winter of 1692. She recounted how the original town elders had sworn a solemn blood oath to keep the cavern mouth forever buried beneath deep river gravel, pledging to record every unusual physical disturbance in the parish register before the frozen ground thawed each spring. Thomas stepped slowly away from the altar rail, his heavy leather boots making a faint, deliberate crunching sound against the thick frost that had gradually formed across the cold stone floorboards. He quietly asked her what had been trapped beneath the solid rock, though deep within his pounding chest, a cold, intuitive dread whispered that he already understood the terrible truth. Clara did not offer him a direct spoken answer. She simply reached deep into the wet folds of her heavy woolen shawl and slowly withdrew a massive iron key, its rough surface heavily encrusted with decades of dark river silt, mineral deposits, and flaky rust. She gently placed the heavy key onto the wooden bench beside her, the cold metal settling into the timber with a dull, hollow thud that echoed ominously down into the very foundations of the church edifice. Thomas reached out his hand toward the rusted iron key, but before his fingers could grasp the cold metal shaft, a fine crystalline trail of frost rapidly bloomed across the bench, surrounding the rust-encrusted iron with a delicate ring of jagged ice. That dull metallic thud was immediately answered from directly beneath the sanctuary floorboards. A slow rhythmic tapping commenced from the darkness below the altar, 3 measured heavy strikes, followed by a long agonizing pause, and then 3 identical strikes more. Thomas dropped to his knees on the freezing flagstones, pressing his left ear directly against the dark narrow seams separating the heavy granite slabs. Through those tight crevices, he smelled the overwhelming pungent odor of stagnant cavern water, wet cedar timber, and old burnt bone. A low rasping whisper rose steadily through the cold floorboards, carrying his own distinct voice right back to him. flawlessly reciting a private Latin prayer he had only ever spoken aloud in the solitude of his personal bedchamber 300 miles away in Boston. The slow, rhythmic tapping beneath the cold sanctuary floorboards grew steadily clearer, rapidly transitioning from a dull, muffled thud into the distinct, deliberate sound of bare human fingers scraping endlessly against raw, underground limestone. Father Mercer pulled his heavy woolen coat tightly around his trembling shoulders, his pale hands shaking violently as he picked up the cold iron key Clara had left upon the dark wooden bench. The freezing metal bit into his sensitive skin with a sharp, burning intensity that made his stiff fingers ache deep to the bone. Clara remained completely motionless by the iron stove, her dark, unblinking gaze fixed entirely on the high-arched windows where the furious blizzard battered relentlessly against the ancient stained glass, casting long, fractured shadows across the empty pews. Thomas stood near the altar rail for a long, silent moment, taking a deep, unsteady breath that chilled his lungs before forcing his heavy feet to move forward across the ice-covered stone floor. The heavy iron key felt like a lump of pure ice in his palm, its jagged edges pressing painfully into his calloused fingers as he approached the dark sacristy door. He walked slowly toward the small, low wooden door situated directly behind the dark sacristy that led straight down into the church's subterranean heating vault. The heavy air in the narrow, damp stairwell was suffocating, thick with accumulated dust, cold ash, and that faint sulfurous tang that had hung continuously over the entire valley since his initial arrival. As Thomas descended the worn stone steps one by one, his small oil lantern cast a pale, unstable, swinging circle of yellow light against the wet masonry walls. Each step creaked loudly under his weight, echoing through the narrow masonry shaft like a warning heartbeat in the freezing subterranean quiet. At the absolute bottom of the steep flight, partially obscured behind massive piles of dry firewood and discarded rust-encrusted iron grates, stood a heavy solid oak door reinforced with thick wrought iron bands. The wood was dark, almost completely black with age, its thick grain heavily stained with dark circular rings that matched the precise size and shape of the solitary ash lines drawn upon the townspeople's windowsills. Thomas stepped much closer, raising his flickering oil lantern higher to inspect the narrow keyhole set deep into the heavy iron plate. The lock mechanism was ancient, its narrow keyway heavily clogged with decades of petrified dust, cobwebs, and dried pine sap. He inserted the rust-encrusted iron key into the narrow slot, feeling the stubborn inner tumblers resist firmly before finally giving way with a sharp, heavy metallic click that echoed ominously down the long, unseen stone passages stretching far beyond the threshold. As the heavy oak door swung slowly inward on its silent, well-oiled hinges, the tiny flame inside his glass lantern flickered violently, shrinking down rapidly to a tiny, trembling blue bead of light that illuminated only the floorboards directly beneath his boots. Beyond the open door lay no dry cellar or simple coal bin. A narrow, natural tunnel lined with dark, wet limestone sloped steeply downward into the earth, its cavernous floor entirely covered in a thick layer of fine, powdery gray ash. Imprinted clearly upon that deep gray ash were fresh, crisp, bare footprints, leading directly from the mouth of the subterranean cavern down into the absolute darkness of the descending tunnel. Thomas knelt trembling on the freezing stone floor to inspect the tracks, noting with mounting psychological dread that the physical prints were small, remarkably precise, and entirely identical to the mysterious footprints he had seen outside his rectory window 2 nights prior. He reached out an uncertain hand to touch the smooth gray ash, but before his fingertips could make contact, a sudden powerful freezing draft rushed violently up from the deep subterranean cavern below. The icy gust extinguished his frail lantern flame completely, plunging the underground passage into absolute suffocating pitch blackness. A split second later, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thunderous crash that automatically locked the heavy iron bolt back into its solid frame. Trapped in the total darkness, Thomas heard the soft, dry rustle of bare feet stepping out from the gray ash just inches ahead of him. The phantom voice that followed did not speak from the cold air around him. It whispered directly inside his mind, reciting the unconfessed sins of his youth in a flat, emotionless monotone. The absolute blackness inside the ancient stone tunnel carried a heavy physical weight, pressing relentlessly against Father Mercer's chest until every slow inhalation felt thin, cold, and entirely insufficient. The violent slamming of the heavy oak door behind him had completely sealed away the lingering howl of the mountain blizzard outside, leaving an unnatural ringing silence that vibrated deeply through the subterranean limestone walls. He reached deep into his wet woolen coat pocket, his trembling fingers freezing and stiff until they finally brushed against the rough wooden box of sulfur matches he had carried from the rectory. Striking a single match against the rough, damp masonry, the tiny yellow flame sputtered briefly to life, illuminating a narrow descending passage carved directly through the living subterranean rock. The freezing air down here was suffocatingly damp and entirely motionless, smelling heavily of ancient river silt, wet slate, and that faint, unmistakable odor of burnt cedar that had lingered continuously in his living quarters since his initial arrival in Blackwood Hollow. Thomas held the fragile burning match forward into the suffocating gloom, watching the faint, flickering light dance uncertainly across the rough, cold walls of the cavern passage. Imprinted remarkably clearly in the light gray ash covering the smooth stone floor were those small, precise bare footprints, leading steadily deeper into the subterranean gloom. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the dry gray ash crunching softly beneath his heavy leather boots with a distinct sound that seemed to carry far down the winding stone shaft. As he progressed deeper beneath the frozen floorboards of the sanctuary above, he noticed with growing unease that the cavern walls were not entirely natural rock formations. At regular measured intervals, crude liturgical symbols had been deeply etched into the dark rock face. Archaic crosses turned completely on their sides, surrounded by deeply carved mathematical lines that formed the precise geometric boundary of the solitary ash. Each symbol had been carved with meticulous, obsessive care, the grooves stained with a dry, dark residue that gave off the sharp tang of old copper under the match flame. After 20 yards of tense, careful walking, the narrow limestone tunnel opened dramatically into a vast vaulted chamber where the natural stone ceiling rose far beyond the reach of his failing match light. In the exact center of this subterranean hall stood a low circular wall constructed entirely from dry stacked fieldstones, surrounding an ancient well shaft that plunged straight down into the mountain's dark hidden aquifer. Resting directly atop the wide stone ledge of the ancient well was a thick leather-bound volume, an identical perfect duplicate of the historical register he had left lying open on the chapel lectern above. The dark leather cover was lightly dusted with a fine layer of gray ash, yet where the damp underground atmosphere touched the dried calfskin, dark, glistening lines of wet ink were actively spreading across the rough surface. The wet ink was writing out the precise minute and second of Thomas's arrival into the dark subterranean vault, the letters forming before his eyes as if guided by an invisible cold hand. As the sulfur match burned down painfully to his bare fingertips, scorching his icy skin, a faint rhythmic sound began to rise steadily from the pitch-black depths of the open well shaft. It was not the distant splashing of rising groundwater or the steady dripping of condensation falling from the subterranean limestone ceiling above. It was the cold, unmistakable sound of a human voice, soft, raspy, and distinctly layered with the exact vocal inflections of every parishioner he had met in Blackwood Hollow since arriving. The collective voices spoke together in perfect, unhurried unison, reciting the solemn opening verses of the traditional funeral service directly back to him from the dark water below. The sound swelled within the vast chamber, echoing off the damp masonry until it felt as though the very walls were breathing the ancient liturgical Latin. Thomas dropped the dying match, plunging the vast chamber back into total suffocating blackness. Yet the ghostly chorus grew louder with every passing second, creeping up the fieldstone well toward him. Father Mercer dropped the spent wooden match, plunging the vast subterranean vault back into complete suffocating darkness. Yet his tired eyes slowly adjusted to a faint violet luminescence rising from the wide mouth of the ancient well. The cool, pale light reflected continuously off the damp limestone walls, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched slowly across the cold stone floor like tall, motionless figures waiting quietly around the altar rail. Thomas stepped cautiously toward the circular stone ledge, his heart hammering rhythmically against his ribs as he stared directly down into the dark, swirling water 30 feet below. Floating motionless on the surface of the black aquifer was the sharp reflection of the chapel above, perfectly inverted, showing the tall stained glass windows glowing with a silent inner fire that burned without heat. The thick leather register resting on the well's cold stone edge opened entirely on its own, its heavy vellum pages turning with a sharp, dry rustle that echoed loudly off the vaulted ceiling. Thomas looked down at the dark, glistening script filling the open pages, slowly realizing that the handwritten entries were no longer historical accounts of past centuries. The damp black ink was actively recording the present moment, detailing his pounding pulse, his shallow breathing, and the exact theological doubts that had plagued his mind since entering the priesthood. Below his own entry, written in a bold, elegant hand that matched his late predecessor's distinct penmanship, was a clear directive requiring the presiding cleric to sign his full name in the damp ash to complete the transfer of the parish records. Thomas stared at the wet script in utter disbelief, feeling the icy coldness of the subterranean vault seep directly through the thick leather soles of his heavy boots. Each hand-written letter seemed to pulse with a subtle, faint heartbeat, drawing the moisture directly from the surrounding freezing air until the dry edges of the ancient vellum began to curl slightly upward. He reached out a trembling hand toward the open ledger, but his icy fingers hesitated just inches above the wet parchment as an overwhelming wave of physical nausea washed over him. The air inside the chamber grew thick with the heavy scent of old incense and decaying wood, making every breath feel like a deliberate struggle against the encroaching dark. From the dark, heavy shadows lining the far side of the underground chamber, a silent figure stepped slowly forward into the pale violet light. It was Clara, still wrapped tightly in her soaked woolen shawl, her pale face completely devoid of all physical emotion or human warmth. She walked without making a single sound against the freezing stone floorboards, stopping precisely at the edge of the circular well directly across from Thomas. Her dark eyes remained fixed entirely on the open historical book, her dark pupils completely covering the pale gray of her irises in the dim light. When she finally spoke, her low voice did not carry the raspy, multi-layered echo from before. She spoke in the quiet, gentle tone of a young woman reciting a familiar prayer from memory. She explained with absolute calmness that the sacred record beneath the mountain was not a curse, but a necessary ledger created to hold the painful memories the valley could no longer carry. Every name spoken in this dark valley is written down, Thomas, she whispered softly, her intense gaze slowly rising to meet his eyes across the dark, open water. If the ledger is left unsigned, the memories return instantly to the living, and the town will remember everything it has done to keep the dark outside. She slowly extended her pale, thin hand across the cold well, holding out a small bone stylus heavily encrusted with dried black river silt. Thomas looked from the crude bone tool to the open register, feeling a heavy, suffocating pressure settle over his chest as the distant sound of church bells began to echo down through the long stone shaft. The heavy iron bell struck 13 measured times into the absolute quiet of the vault, each resounding chime vibrating through his bone marrow with unsettling power. The extra tolling bell vibrated deeply through the damp limestone walls, shaking loose fine white dust that drifted down slowly into the black water below. He realized with growing terror that the 13th strike was not a tolling for the dead, but an absolute summons for his own living signature upon the wet parchment. If he refused the bone stylus, the town would drown in its own forgotten horrors before dawn, leaving him as the sole witness to their inevitable descent into madness. The 13 heavy strokes of the chapel bell continued to vibrate deeply through the damp subterranean limestone walls, each strike sending a visible ripple across the dark surface of the underground well. Father Thomas Mercer stood frozen at the edge of the circular wall, his breathing labored and fast, staring down into the inverted reflection of the sanctuary above. The faint violet luminescence rising from the aquifer had deepened into a thick, cold mist that clung to his heavy boots, smelling sharply of wet iron and dried ash. Across the narrow chasm, Clara remained completely motionless, her pale hand still outstretched toward him, holding the small bone stylus carved from ancient river silt. Her face was hollow, bathed in the pale light, her expression bearing neither malice nor comfort, only the absolute terrifying stillness of a human vessel waiting to be fulfilled. He looked down at the dark leather register resting open on the cold stone ledge between them. The dark, glistening script was no longer merely recording his immediate thoughts. It was actively consuming the remaining white margins of the vellum pages, spreading like delicate black vines across the ancient sheepskin. As Thomas watched in mounting horror, the handwritten text detailed the precise names of every family living in Blackwood Hollow, listing their forgotten transgressions, their silent cruelties, and the exact weight of the grievances they had buried beneath the floorboards of their homes for generations. The ledger was not a chronicle of divine grace. It was a cold, exhaustive record of every shadow the village had attempted to cast out into the dark. Every hidden sin, every act of violence covered by winter snow, was laid bare upon the glistening vellum in meticulous, elegant ink. A sudden sharp pain flared in Thomas's right hand, pulling his gaze violently away from the open book. The skin across his trembling palm was darkening, staining with the same damp, indelible ink that filled the register, as if his own blood were slowly turning into the medium of the record. Clara stepped closer to the edge, the hem of her woolen shawl brushing against the rough stone wall without making a sound. She told him that his predecessor, the cleric who had vanished 50 years prior, had refused to complete the entry, leaving the parish's account unbalanced and allowing the subterranean frost to rise into the valley's water supply. The town had rotted slowly from the inside because the heavy debt of memory remained unpaid. Thomas raised his head, his vision blurring slightly as the freezing air inside the subterranean vault pulled the warmth directly from his eyes. He reached out with his stained fingers, his hand trembling so violently that he could barely hold his balance against the slippery stone ledge. The air around him began to whisper again, hundreds of soft, dry voices rising simultaneously from the dark water below, chanting his name in a flat, rhythmic cadence that matched the heavy pulse in his temples. He lowered the bone stylus slowly toward the wet ash at the bottom of the page, realizing that if he placed his signature upon the vellum, his own history would be bound to the cavern forever, sealing the vault while erasing every memory of his existence from the world above. His name would evaporate entirely from the official records of the diocese. His face would vanish from the photographs of his youth, and the townspeople would walk past his empty rectory without ever recalling who had tended to their souls during the terrible blizzard. He was not being saved. He was being exchanged to keep the ancient ledger balanced against the encroaching dark. The bone stylus touched the wet ash at the bottom of the page, sending a violent jolt of pure ice straight up his forearm to his racing heart. The voices from the well abruptly cut to absolute suffocating silence as the black ink rapidly crept up the bone stylus, wrapping around his trembling fingers like living threads. In the cold quiet above, the chapel bells began to strike a 14th time. The tiny sharp tip of the ancient bone stylus hovered less than a single inch directly above the damp vellum, its dark shadow cast exceptionally long and sharp against the illuminated script by the cold violet glow rising continuously from the subterranean well. Father Mercer's bruised white knuckles were entirely locked in a desperate, agonizing physical struggle against the invisible crushing pressure that weighed heavily upon his trembling wrists. From the dark, hidden depths of the swirling water far beneath them, the multi-layered chanting grew steadily louder, transforming rapidly into a dense, reverberating hum that shook the dry stone masonry of the ancient circular well. The fragile reflection of the chapel floating on the smooth black surface began to distort violently, the stained glass windows fracturing into thousands of sharp, glittering points of light that drifted slowly upward like pale embers through the freezing, icy mist. Clara did not move her extended hand even a fraction of an inch, but her dark, unblinking pupils dilated further until no white remained visible in her cold eyes, effectively turning her fixed gaze into two empty black spheres that mirrored the absolute blackness of the surrounding cavern walls. She spoke clearly in a low, unnatural voice that was no longer her own, a cold, measured tone that blended the distinct vocal inflections of the ancient clerics who had first carved the liturgical symbols deep into the wet limestone centuries ago. She informed him with absolute detachment that the furious winter storm above had completely buried the entire valley, sealing every wooden window frame and heavy front door beneath 10 feet of hard-packed mountain ice. She added that the isolated townspeople were currently sitting together in total suffocating darkness, watching their delicate protective lines of solitary ash dissolve into wet gray sludge upon their frozen sills. A sudden violent tremor rippled through the subterranean floor of the vast vault, cracking the heavy granite slabs surrounding the wide base of the ancient well. The dark, foul water within the deep shaft began to rise rapidly, surging upward toward the cold stone ledge with a thick, viscous churning that carried the heavy, suffocating scent of burnt cedar and wet clay. Thomas backed away slowly from the ledge, his leather boots slipping precariously against the wet gray ash covering the smooth cavern floor, but his right arm remained magnetically drawn toward the open historical book as if bound securely by invisible copper wires. The damp, indelible ink on his pale skin had already spread far up his forearm, staining his heavy woolen sleeve with dark, wet patterns that mimicked the precise liturgical symbols etched into the surrounding limestone walls. As the rising groundwater finally touched the broad bottom of the open leather register, the ancient vellum pages did not dissolve, wrinkle, or tear in the foul liquid. Instead, the thick parchment absorbed the fluid instantly, turning completely translucent and glowing with a brilliant, blinding white light that illuminated every hidden corner of the vast subterranean hall. Through the crystal-clear, glowing pages, Thomas suddenly saw a vivid, terrifying vision of his own rectory above. Not as it stood today in the grip of the fierce blizzard, but as it would appear a full century in the uncertain future. The old wooden building was completely abandoned and decayed, its massive roof long since collapsed under the relentless weight of time and endless snow. Meanwhile, inside the quiet, climate-controlled underground vault of an unknown, distant historical society, a young archivist was slowly reaching out a pale hand to open a heavy, nameless calfskin volume that bore no title upon its worn spine. Thomas gasped for air as the realization struck his mind like a physical blow. The ledger was an unbroken chain, and his own sacrifice in this frozen vault was merely one entry among hundreds, waiting to be read by someone who had not yet been born. The blinding white light radiating intensely from the open vellum pages pierced directly through the suffocating subterranean gloom, reflecting off the steadily rising groundwater until the entire underground hall resembled a vast cavernous chamber carved entirely from solid, glistening ice. Father Thomas Mercer stood completely paralyzed and staring in utter horror at his own right hand, watching as the cold black wet ink fully saturated his pale skin, creeping inexorably up past his wrist like a living shadowy parasite that claimed his living flesh inch by agonizing inch. Across the narrow, treacherous chasm of the ancient well, Clara remained completely stationary in the pale mist, her hollow, unblinking eyes mirroring the brilliant, blinding glare of the illuminated historical script. The multi-layered chanting voices rising from the dark aquifer had gradually dissolved into a single terrifying low frequency that resonated directly inside the dense bones of his skull, vibrating continuously with the slow, heavy rhythm of a massive iron pendulum. He gripped the small bone stylus much tighter in his trembling fist, feeling the freezing smooth marrow press painfully against his aching finger joints. The ancient stone ledge beneath his heavy boots vibrated violently as the subterranean water level surged rapidly higher, spilling dark sulfurous brine over the circular rim and down onto the cracked granite floor. The foul subterranean liquid hissed sharply as it made direct contact with the thin layer of dry gray ash covering the stones, instantly releasing a thick, choking white vapor that smelled sharply of cold ozone and old petrified pine dust. Thomas realized with overwhelming psychological horror that the ancient record was no longer waiting for his conscious consent. The subterranean vault was actively and aggressively pulling his entire identity into the glowing parchment, systematically dissolving every boundary between the living parish priest and the cold historical ledger of Blackwood Hollow. Through the rising white mist, he slowly discerned the dark, shadowy outlines of past clerics standing silently along the outer perimeter of the vast cavern. Gloom-shrouded figures whose names had been completely erased from the diocesan archives decades ago, their faces pale, featureless, and frozen under the cold violet light. They did not speak a single word or step forward toward him. They stood merely as silent, motionless sentinels of the threshold, waiting patiently for the final stroke of the bone quill to seal the parish account once and for all. Every prayer Thomas had ever recited in his long ecclesiastical career, every familiar face he had ever loved, and every quiet, peaceful afternoon he had spent in his forgotten youth began to rapidly fade and dissolve from his conscious memory, replaced entirely by the cold technical details of the town's forgotten transgressions. The overwhelming weight of a century of silent sins pressed down upon his shoulders, threatening to shatter his sanity as the ancient limestone cavern vibrated with the unseen heartbeat of the mountain. Gathering the absolute final remnant of his fading human will, Father Thomas pressed the sharp tip of the bone stylus deep into the wet, glowing sheepskin at the bottom of the open page. The exact moment the carved bone made physical contact with the illuminated parchment, a sharp, deafening crack echoed through the subterranean cavern, sounding precisely as if a thick slab of solid iron had fractured under immense, crushing pressure. The dark, wet ink saturating his hand rushed violently down through his trembling fingers, flowing rapidly into the bone tool and flooding the white surface of the ledger with a heavy, indelible seal that locked his full name into the stone vault forever. The blinding illumination instantly vanished into absolute suffocating pitch blackness, leaving only the sound of heavy iron locks sliding firmly into place beneath the frozen earth. The moment the final letter of Father Mercer's signature dissolved completely into the glowing vellum, the surging water inside the ancient well ground to an absolute halt, freezing into a smooth black mirror that reflected no light. The thick white vapor lingering in the air vanished in a single instant, pulled down into the narrow crevices of the subterranean limestone floor like water draining through fine sand. Across the stone ledge, Clara's pale frame began to lose its sharp outline, her woolen shawl and hollow features blurring into soft, pale strands of gray mist that drifted harmlessly into the dark recesses of the vaulted ceiling. The silence that settled over the subterranean hall was absolute. No echoing voices from the deep well, no dripping groundwater from the arches, and no distant tolling of chapel bells from above. Thomas looked down at his trembling right hand, finding his skin completely clear of the dark ink, though his palm retained a pale geometric scar where the bone stylus had rested against his flesh. The heavy leather register resting on the well's stone edge snapped shut with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a massive tombstone settling into fresh earth. The heavy brass clasps bound themselves remarkably tight around the calfskin cover, sealing the volume behind a solid iron lock that possessed no keyhole. He lingered for a brief moment beside the well, staring down into the black frozen water where his reflection had once floated alongside the chapel's stained glass windows. The icy surface showed nothing now, neither his face nor the vaulted ceiling above, as if the aquifer had absorbed his shadow along with his name. He turned slowly toward the dark exit tunnel, his heavy leather boots moving soundlessly across the dry stone floor. The gray ash that had previously covered the passage was entirely gone, swept clean by the subterranean draft, leaving only the bare ancient limestone exposed beneath his feet. As he climbed the winding rock stairs toward the heavy oak door of the sacristy, he felt no physical cold, no exhaustion, and no lingering fear in his heart. The heavy weight that had pressed against his chest since his initial arrival in Blackwood Hollow had dissolved entirely, replaced by a strange hollow tranquility that felt as deep and indifferent as the mountain itself. He paused halfway up the stone shaft, listening for the howling blizzard that had tormented his quarters since he arrived. But the tunnel carried only the pristine quiet of frozen rock. His hand touched the cold iron latch of the sacristy door, his fingers feeling smooth and unmarred, save for the faint geometric mark etched into his palm. He pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the quiet sacristy of the chapel. The howling blizzard outside had died down completely to a gentle, motionless fall of fine white powder, and the morning sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge of the valley. Sunlight poured through the tall, stained glass, casting long, pale beams across the polished floorboards of the empty sanctuary. Yet, as Thomas walked slowly down the central aisle toward the chapel's front entrance, he stopped beside the wooden pews, catching his reflection in the tall glass windows. Standing beside him in the glass was no living man. The window reflected only the empty pews, the quiet altar, and the heavy leather register resting unopened upon the lectern, its pages completely blank under the pale winter light. The morning light filtering through the high arched windows of the chapel did not warm the stone interior. It lay across the empty wooden pews in pale, lifeless strips that cast no physical heat. Father Thomas Mercer stood motionless near the altar rail, watching his transparent hand pass effortlessly through the solid mahogany surface without disturbing the fine layer of winter dust resting upon the wood. The quiet inside the sanctuary was absolute and suffocating, unbroken by the rustle of wind outside or the familiar breathing of a congregation. Down in the deep valley, the village of Blackwood Hollow remained completely silent beneath a 10-foot blanket of packed ice, its stone chimneys cold and its narrow streets empty, as if the entire community had dissolved into the white expanse surrounding the ridge. He walked slowly toward the open lectern where the heavy leather register lay, its calfskin binding completely dry and free of the dark sulfurous moisture that had soaked its pages during the night. The script filling the vellum leaves was no longer written in wet, glistening ink. The letters had set deep into the fibers of the sheepskin, taking on the faded iron gall hue of entries recorded centuries ago. Every name, every unconfessed grievance, and every secret act committed within the valley had been bound forever into the parchment, preserved behind a cold liturgical seal that admitted no revision. Thomas looked down at the bottom of the final page, where his own signature sat etched into the sheepskin, surrounded by the geometric line of the solitary ash. He reached out a trembling finger to touch his written name, but his intangible skin glided over the parchment like wind over stone, leaving no impression upon the sacred record. The realization washed over him with the weight of an iron anchor. He was no longer an observer in Blackwood Hollow, but a permanent part of the foundation holding the silence together. From the quiet shadows of the sacristy doorway, a solitary figure stepped forward into the pale morning light. It was not Clara, nor was it the multi-layered entity that had summoned him to the subterranean vault. Standing near the iron heating grate was a young man wearing the dark wool coat of a 19th century archivist, carrying a heavy brass lantern that emitted no heat or visible flame. The stranger did not look at Thomas. His eyes remained fixed entirely on the open register resting upon the oak stand. He reached out with gloved fingers, turning the heavy vellum pages with a slow, methodical care that produced no sound against the quiet air of the sanctuary. The archivist paused at the final entry, tracing the sharp outline of Thomas's signature with the tip of an ivory bone pointer. As the bone instrument touched the dried ink, a faint, resonant vibration hummed through the glass panes of the windows, echoing down into the dark limestone caverns below the floorboards. The man closed the heavy volume, engaging the brass clasps until they locked firmly into place with a sharp, definitive click. He lifted the heavy register into his arms, turned away from the altar rail, and walked quietly into the darkened passage of the sacristy. Thomas watched him disappear into the gloom, feeling the last threads of his earthly presence unraveling in the stillness. He was left standing completely alone in the silent, sunlit sanctuary as the ambient light began to fracture into thousands of glittering, frost-covered shards that drifted upward toward the vaulted ceiling. Nearly a century later, inside the quiet, climate-controlled vault of the St. Jude Historical Society, the still air smelled faintly of dry paper, leather preservative, and old petrified dust. The institution's senior head archivist sat at a broad, polished oak restoration table, carefully lifting a heavy calfskin-bound volume from a sealed, airtight archival box. The mysterious volume bore no gold leaf title on its spine, no administrative stamp from the regional diocese, and no catalog number within the official state registry. Yet, despite its immense age, the binding remained remarkably intact, its dark leather supple and smooth, showing no signs of the dry rot or insect damage that typically plague documents recovered from the long-abandoned settlements of Upper New York. The archivist slowly pulled on a pair of clean white cotton gloves, carefully adjusting the bright halogen desk lamp above his organized workspace before unbuckling the heavy brass clasps. As the heavy cover swung open, a faint acrid draft swept through the quiet subterranean room, a brief cold breeze that carried the unmistakable scent of burnt cedar, stagnant well water, and wet river silt. He turned slowly through the heavy vellum pages, admiring the precise iron gall penmanship that cataloged the obscure administrative records of Blackwood Hollow from the late 19th century. The handwritten entries were meticulous and exhaustive, detailing freezing weather patterns, declining crop yields, and the exact names of short-lived parish appointments that had vanished entirely from official church histories. He reached the final page of the manuscript, where the dark ink retained a deep, lustrous sheen that looked almost fresh beneath the warm glow of the desk light. Below a complex geometric border drawn in pulverized charcoal, a single elegant signature closed the ledger: Father Thomas Mercer, presiding cleric. Beside the handwritten name, written in a smaller, delicate shorthand, was a brief marginal note indicating that the parish register had been successfully balanced and transferred to the permanent vault beneath the earth. The archivist smiled slightly at the quiet dedication of the forgotten country scholar, reaching for his fountain pen to log the acquisition number into his digital database before shutting the volume for the evening. The room grew noticeably colder within seconds, causing his breath to bloom into a small pale cloud above the open sheepskin pages. Before his gloved hand could make physical contact with the leather cover, the digital audio monitor resting on the corner of his oak desk clicked to life entirely on its own, its internal microphone picking up a sudden low-frequency hum within the silent vault. Through the small speaker came the soft, dry rustle of turning parchment, followed immediately by the raspy, suffocating sound of two distinct voices speaking in perfect, unhurried unison from the empty far corner of the archive. The audio recording contained no static or background interference. It carried the clear, crystalline resonance of a voice reciting Thomas Mercer's full name, followed by the quiet, rhythmic tapping of bare, wet feet pacing across the cold concrete floor directly behind the archivist's chair. He sat frozen in place, unable to turn his head toward the shadow rising slowly against the whitewashed wall behind him. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.